The dog wouldn't stop barking. That was the first thing Corporal Adaeze Nwosu heard when she stepped out of the sliding doors at Sunridge General that Tuesday night. Not the wind off the Rockies, not the distant hum of the Deerfoot, but a Belgian Malinois losing his mind somewhere in the darkness of the east parking lot. She almost kept walking. She'd just pulled a 12-hour shift in the trauma ward. Her feet were done, and the March air had that particular Calgary bite that gets into your joints and stays there. She had leftover pasta at home. She had a bath running in her head. She had exactly zero capacity left for anyone else's problem. But the dog didn't stop. Adaeze stood at the edge of the lot for a second, keys in hand, listening. It wasn't the kind of barking that meant a dog wanted dinner, or was bored, or had spotted a squirrel. She knew what that sounded like. This was different, jagged, frantic. The sound of an animal who understood something was wrong and couldn't make anyone understand it back. She walked toward it. The lot was mostly empty that time of night. A few staff cars, a pickup truck with a cracked taillight. 2 rows over, near the concrete barrier at the far end, she could see the shape of a man on the ground. Sitting, or maybe slumped, it was hard to tell, and beside him, a large dog on a lead, pulling and straining and barking at nothing and everything. "Hey," she called out, "you okay?" The man didn't answer. She moved faster. His name, she would learn later, was Warrant Officer Gerald Tanner. Retired, medically released after 12 years in the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, 2 tours in Kandahar, and 1 roadside device that had shredded the left side of his body so thoroughly that the surgeons at Landstuhl had spent 9 hours putting him back together like a person-shaped puzzle. He was 53. He lived alone in a basement suite in Forest Lawn. He had a monthly prescription he picked up at the pharmacy 2 blocks from the hospital, and he came here because the pharmacist knew his name and gave him a senior's discount, even though he wasn't quite there yet. And those kinds of small dignities mattered when you were living on a disability pension. And pride was one of the few things left that didn't cost anything. He'd come out of the pharmacy, crossed through the hospital's east entrance to cut through to the bus stop, and somewhere between the sliding doors and the parking barrier, his blood pressure had done what it occasionally did when his medication wasn't sitting right and his legs had just stopped cooperating. Adaeze didn't know any of that yet. What she knew was that he was conscious but barely. His pulse was thready, and the dog, a Malinois named Kodiak, whose vest read Surface Animal, do not pet, was standing over him with every muscle in his body at full attention. "Sir, I'm a nurse. Can you hear me?" Gerald's eyes opened. They were gray, exhausted, the color of a February sky. He looked at her, looked at Kodiak, looked back at her. "Don't. Let him go," he said. "His lead. I've got him," she said, even though she hadn't touched the lead yet. "I've got him. Just stay still." She called inside on her radio, got a wheelchair and a porter out within 3 minutes, helped get Gerald stabilized and back into the building. She held Kodiak's lead the whole time, because she'd promised she would. And the dog walked beside the wheelchair with his entire focus locked on the old soldier, like he was calculating the safest path through enemy territory. They got Gerald sorted. Low blood pressure, mild dehydration, nothing that a saline drip and 2 hours in a recliner wouldn't fix. His doctor on file was paged. His emergency contact, a sister in Lethbridge, was called. He was going to be okay. Adaeze sat with him for a few minutes while they waited for the IV to do its work. Kodiak had settled at Gerald's feet with his chin on his paws, but his eyes still open, still watching. "How long have you had him?" she asked. Gerald looked down at the dog. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. 6 years. Got him through a veterans program. After the last bad stretch, he paused. He knows before I do when it's coming. Used to think it was strange. Now I'd be lost without him. Adaeze nodded. She'd worked enough psych rotations to know what he wasn't saying. She went home late. She ate her pasta cold. She thought about Gerald and Kodiak on the bus ride home, and then she thought about how many other Geralds there were. Men and women who'd handed over something enormous and come home to navigate a system that wasn't really built for them, with a dog and a monthly prescription and a bus pass. She didn't think she'd see them again. She was wrong. 6 weeks later, Adaeze was on the early shift, covering the emergency intake desk while Preeti went for break, when a man came through the east entrance in a way that made every instinct she had go cold. He was moving too fast. Not running, but close. That particular controlled speed that people use when they're trying not to look like they're running. And the gap between trying and doing is not very wide. He was young, mid-20s maybe, wearing a gray hoodie pulled low. He had his hands in the front pocket. He smelled like alcohol and something chemical underneath it, and his eyes had that blown-out, unfocused quality that Adaeze had learned, over 5 years in the ER, to treat as a specific kind of warning signal. She stood up. He didn't come to the desk. He walked past it, toward the corridor that connected to the pharmacy wing, and she almost let it go. Maybe he was visiting someone. Maybe he was lost. Maybe she was pattern matching too hard after a long morning. And then she heard Kodiak. Same bark, same register. She would have recognized it anywhere. She came around the desk. Gerald was in the corridor 20 feet ahead, moving slowly with his cane, Kodiak on his left side, and the man in the gray hoodie had stopped walking and was standing between them and the exit in a way that was not accidental. She heard the man say something low and fast. She didn't catch the words. She saw Gerald go still. She was already moving. "Hey," she said, loud enough to carry. Sir, can I help you find something?" It was the standard deflection they trained you on. Break the attention. Introduce a third presence. Give the situation room to breathe. It worked sometimes. It worked often enough that it was worth trying. It didn't work this time. She never saw the knife until it was already in motion. Later, the police would tell her it was a fixed blade, about 4 inches. The kind of thing you could buy at any Canadian Tire in the country. She didn't process the shape of it or the look of it in the moment. What she processed was Gerald's face, the way his body registered danger and his leg braced, and he was too slow. He was going to be too slow. And Kodiak going absolutely rigid on the lead, every hair standing up, making a sound low in his chest that was not quite a growl. She stepped between them. The first one caught her in the shoulder. She felt it as pressure before she felt it as pain, which is how the body protects you, at least for a few seconds. She grabbed the man's wrist. Her training said grab the weapon hand, never the blade. Always the wrist, and they struggled, and she took the second one across the ribs, and the third somewhere in the side, and she held on, because if she let go, Gerald was going to fall, and she wasn't going to let that happen. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, she heard Gerald shout something. She heard Kodiak. She heard the man cry out. Sharp, sudden, and then the pressure of the struggle shifted, and the man was pulling back, stumbling, and a security guard was there, and then 2 nurses from the station around the corner, and someone was saying her name, and she was on the floor, and she wasn't entirely sure when that had happened. Gerald was kneeling beside her. He wasn't supposed to be kneeling. It was bad for his left knee. She knew that from 6 weeks ago, and his face was completely white. "Adaeze," he said. "Adaeze, stay with me," she thought. He remembered my name. She thought, the pasta is going to be cold again tonight. And then the pain arrived, and she stopped thinking in complete sentences for a while. She took 4 wounds, the shoulder, 2 along the left side of her rib cage, and 1 that had gone deeper than the others. The 4th one, which the trauma team would later describe, with clinical understatement, as the one we were most concerned about. The 5th came during the struggle as she was falling, shallow across the back of her hand, which she genuinely did not remember happening, and only noticed in the hospital room 3 days later when she looked at her own hand and found the bandage there. 5 stab wounds. She'd walked out of a 12-hour shift and walked back in on a stretcher, and she'd been upright for exactly 40 minutes in between. The surgery took 3 hours. Her mother flew in from Edmonton the next morning and sat in the chair beside the bed with her hands folded and her jaw set in the expression that meant she was not going to fall apart. Not here, not yet, because there was still work to do. The attacker had been restrained by the security guard, and Gerald, with his cane and his bad knee, had taken the man down from behind, while Kodiak maintained about 4 inches of distance from his arm, close enough to make the calculation extremely clear. Police arrived within 8 minutes. The man was 24, known to AWC, dealing with something that had gotten catastrophically out of hand that morning. He was charged. Adaeze didn't spend much energy thinking about him in the weeks that followed. There was too much else to think about. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, lying in the surgical ward on the 3rd floor of Sunridge General, was what was happening outside. Gerald had called his sister from the waiting room. His sister had called the Royal Canadian Legion branch in Lethbridge. Someone at the Legion had mentioned it to a veterans family group on Facebook, not to start anything, just to say what had happened, to pass the word. The post had been shared by a woman whose son was at CFB Shiloh. He'd shared it to a veterans network group. That group had a member in Calgary who called someone at CFB Calgary. And then things had moved in the way that things move in those communities. Quietly, efficiently, without anyone being in charge of it exactly. And by 6 o'clock the next evening, they were there. Adaeze didn't see them arrive. She was asleep when it started. Her mother was the one who looked up at the sound of boots in the corridor and went to the window that overlooked the main entrance and put her hand over her mouth. A nurse came into the room. Young, French name on her badge. Boutin, Adaeze would remember later for some reason. She was trying to maintain her professional composure and not quite managing. "Monsieur Nwosu," she said, "I think you should see this." Adaze's mother helped her to the window. The parking lot, the east parking lot, the same one where she'd heard Kodiak barking 6 weeks ago, was full. Not hospital busy full, full in a different way. There were people in uniform and people in civilian clothes, men and women, old and young, some with medals on their lapels, and some with unit patches on their shoulders, and some with nothing visible at all except for the way they were standing, which is a thing you learn to recognize if you've spent any time around military people. The way they hold the ground they're on. There were RCMP officers. There were CF members in various branch dress uniforms. There were veterans from the PPCLI and the RCR and other units whose insignia Adaze's mother couldn't identify. There were nurses from other hospitals who'd heard through the healthcare networks, There were ordinary Calgarians who'd seen the news and come because they needed to do something. And this was the something available. There were people holding coffee cups, and people holding flowers, and people holding nothing at all, just standing there, in the cold, in the dark, because a nurse had stepped between a knife and a veteran, and they thought that deserved to be witnessed. Adaeze stood at the window for a long time. Gerald was down there. She spotted him eventually. He wasn't hard to find, because Kodiak was with him, and a Belgian Malinois in a service vest has a certain visual gravity. Gerald was standing near the edge of the group, not at the front. He wasn't the kind of man to stand at the front of anything. She was coming to understand. He was looking up at the building. She thought he probably couldn't see her from that distance. But she raised her hand anyway. The recovery was not easy, and she would not pretend it was. The fourth wound had nicked something close enough to her left lung that the surgeons had spent the better part of an hour making sure it hadn't gone further, and the resulting care was extensive, and the restrictions were serious. And her mother moved into her apartment for 3 weeks and made egusi soup every second day, and did not discuss it as a choice she was making, simply as a fact of how things were going to be. Adaeze was not good at stillness. She had never been good at stillness. She'd joined the Canadian Forces at 22, done medical training at CFB Borden, deployed once with a Role 3 medical unit to a forward operating base in a context she didn't discuss in detail, come home and transitioned to civilian nursing because she needed something different. Needed to sleep in the same bed more than 6 days in a row, needed to see her mother on a regular basis, needed to feel like she was building something that wouldn't be dismantled and moved to a new location every 8 months. She did not regret what she'd done in the corridor. People asked her about it. Reporters called the hospital's communication department and were politely redirected. A journalist from the Calgary Herald did eventually reach her by email, and she thought about it for 3 days and wrote back a single paragraph saying that she didn't think she'd done anything unusual and that she hoped people would think more often about the barriers veterans faced accessing basic healthcare supports, and also that Kodiak was an exceptionally good dog. The journalist quoted all of it and added a note at the end that said Nwosu had declined to be photographed, which was true. What she didn't say, and couldn't quite articulate to herself yet, was the thing she kept circling back to in the quiet hours of recovery. She hadn't thought about it. That was what kept her awake sometimes, not with fear, but with something stranger, a kind of wonder. She had moved and her body had made the decision, and then her mind had caught up somewhere in the middle of the falling. And she wasn't sure what that meant about her, or about the training, or about the years she'd spent learning to make decisions in rooms where decisions had consequences. She thought, maybe that's what 5 years of trauma nursing does to a person. Maybe that's what a forward operating base does. Maybe by the time your body has answered enough emergencies, it knows how to answer one more without asking permission. Or maybe, and this was the thought that felt truest, maybe she'd just heard a dog barking and followed it, and the rest had taken care of itself. Gerald came to see her during the 2nd week. He called first. He was old-fashioned about that. She would learn, and asked if it was a good time, which it was. And he arrived at 2 o'clock on a Wednesday with Kodiak and a small tin of butter cookies from the superstore because, he explained, he hadn't known what to bring, and cookies seemed safe. You didn't have to, she said. I know, he said, and sat down in the chair her mother usually occupied. Kodiak made a thorough inspection of the apartment, identified the safest corner, and folded himself into it with the dignity of a creature who had seen much and drawn conclusions. They talked for a long time, longer than she expected. Gerald turned out to be a different person sitting down than he was lying on a parking lot floor or standing in a hospital corridor. Less fragile, or not fragile at all really, more just careful. The way someone gets careful after they've learned where the edges are. He talked about Kandahar. Not the details, but the outline. The heat, the dust, the particular weight of a certain kind of decision. She talked about the FOB. They shared a vocabulary that most of the people in her life didn't have, and there was ease in that, a compression. He told her that when he'd seen her step in front of him, his first thought had been no, not her, which he said with a kind of quiet fierceness that made her understand it had cost him something, all those months since, carrying the knowledge that he was the reason. "It wasn't your fault," she said. "I know," he said. Same intonation as before. He believed it and he didn't believe it, the way people carry things they can't quite put down. "Kodiak found me first," she said. "You were already halfway to solving your own problem." Gerald looked at the dog in the corner. Kodiak looked back at him with the bottomless patience of a creature with no interest in any interpretation of events except the correct one. "He likes you," Gerald said. "He doesn't usually like people." "I like him too," Adaeze said, and she did. She went back to work 11 weeks after the surgery. Her union had fought hard for her, which she appreciated, and the hospital had put resources in place that she appreciated more on paper than she did in practice. Because she was not the kind of person who wanted a reserved parking space and a formal check-in protocol, she was the kind of person who wanted to be useful and be trusted to know her own limits. She came back on a Tuesday morning shift. The team had been quietly briefed not to make a big deal of it, which meant, of course, that 3 people cried immediately, and someone had put a card on the nursing station that 40 people had signed, including the overnight security guard who'd been first on scene and who had written, in large, careful letters, "You didn't hesitate. Thank you." She'd stood there reading that for a minute, and then she'd put the card in her locker and gotten her assignment and gone to work, because that was what you did. The east parking lot was the same as it always was. Cars, concrete, the smell of exhaust, and Calgary winter in the air. She walked through it every shift, and she didn't stop walking through it, because she'd decided early in the recovery that she wasn't going to let a gray hoodie and 4 inches of steel rearrange her relationship to a parking lot. What she noticed in the weeks after she came back was that the veterans who came through, and there were more of them than most people would guess, coming through emergency, coming through outpatient, navigating the transition points where the military's care hands off to the civilian system and the handoff is not always smooth. Those veterans would sometimes end up at her station, referred or asking or just somehow landing there. She started paying a different kind of attention. She made notes. She talked to the social work team. She connected with a woman named Dr. Osibansu at the Veterans Affairs Liaison Office who had been trying for 3 years to establish a better continuity protocol at Sunridge and kept hitting bureaucratic walls. Adaeze had not historically been someone who enjoyed fighting bureaucratic walls, but she was learning that certain experiences change the nature of what you're willing to be patient about. Gerald came to her clinic twice. Kodiak came with him both times and was permitted because the hospital had updated its service animal policy the previous year, and also because there were approximately 0 people on Adaeze's unit who were going to tell Gerald Tanner that his dog had to wait outside. The second time, in the corridor after his appointment, Gerald said, "You're different." "From what?" she said. "From what you were before. Not worse. Just different." He paused. More certain about something. Adaeze thought about that. "I think I know what I'm doing this for now," she said. "I knew before, but now I know it differently." Gerald nodded. He understood that sentence completely. She'd known he would. Kodiak walked between them down the corridor, his nails clicking quietly on the linoleum, his head up and his eyes forward, navigating whatever came next. Months later, in November, the Veterans Care Continuity Program at Sunridge General received its first round of provincial funding. A pilot fought for, in language that Adaeze did not write but reviewed carefully. At 2 a.m. in her kitchen, with a cup of tea going cold on the counter, annotating in the margins. Dr. Adaeze Nwosu called her when it went through, and they stayed on the phone for a few minutes, not really saying anything in particular, just existing in the same frequency of relief. Adaeze had not asked to be in the press release. She wasn't. The program was the thing. The program was what mattered. She went to work the next day and the day after that. The East Lot was cold in November, the first real cold, the kind that means business. She crossed it at 6:45 in the morning with her badge clipped and her coffee still hot and the dark lifting slowly over the Rockies to the west. That particular Calgary dawn that always looked more like a painting than a thing that was actually happening. She thought about Kodiak barking in the dark. She thought about following a sound into a parking lot because something in her body said go. She thought about 11 weeks of recovery and her mother's soup and the card in her locker and Gerald's face, white as February, saying her name. She thought, most of the things that change your life don't announce themselves first. She pushed through the sliding doors. She went to work.